Welcome to our workshop, Outcome-Based Financing, Evaluating Equity Implications. We have a very exciting lineup. Let's start with the definition. Outcome-based financing is an emerging form of education finance that uses outcome data to determine which school students to lend to and at what price. So while traditional lenders look at individual metrics like credit score and then charge everyone the same interest rate no matter where they're going to school, outcome-based financing providers de-emphasize credit score and instead look at the institution and field of study that the student is enrolled in. These providers may then refuse to lend to students at poorly performing or predatory schools. This approach is used by lenders like Meritize and Climb Credit that offer traditional loan products to students, as well as a wide variety of schools and providers, including MentorWorks and Stride Funding that offer income share agreements or other non-traditional credit products. Now, there's a debate over whether this approach improves or undermines racial, gender, or economic equity. In the last year, some providers have been criticized for pricing their financial products in a way that may result in higher prices charged to students at minority-serving institutions like HBCUs or those in more female-dominated fields of study. In contrast, these outcome-based finance providers, many of whom themselves are women or persons of color, believe that what they're doing is improving equity by attacking existing structural inequities in the system. So let's have the debate. We have 8 experts responding to the following resolution. Outcomes-based financing promotes greater racial, gender, and economic equity. Let's listen.
Hi, my name is Denise Davis, and I'm with Imaginable Futures. Outcomes-based financing promotes greater racial, gender, and economic equity as it incentivizes post-secondary institutions to focus on outcomes as opposed to enrollment, and therefore helps to drive quality. The stark reality is that many institutions are not preparing students equitably for the workforce. Millions of students are defaulting on their student loans because they are not able to attain jobs post-graduation or have stopped out, with 36 million Americans having some college credit but no degree and high debt. This significantly impacts Black learners who, even with a bachelor's degree, default 5 times the rate of white bachelor degree graduates. And the highest default rates among all students are for those who went to for-profit institutions, many of which have low-quality programs that didn't provide students with the supports needed to get a good job with family-sustaining wages. It is crucial for the higher education system to design with outcomes for all students in mind.
Hi, my name is Jessica Thompson with the Institute for College Access and Success. Unfortunately, I fear the opposite, that outcome-based financing has the potential to cause harm to low-income students, female students, and students of color. Having followed this industry for years, I know there are some truly well-intentioned folks looking for private market solutions to public policy problems. But here's what's really driving the growth of this market. Private investors are using the public's frustration with student debt to pitch profit-generating financial products. Proponents claim that this is cheaper and fairer for students and will incentivize colleges to prepare their grads for well-paying careers. But an income share agreement is simply student debt by another name, with the added danger of deceptive marketing. It's also misleading to policymakers who are under intense industry pressure to create a new and looser regulatory scheme to govern ISAs. Even more concerning is that to generate a return on investment, these products are typically priced based on projections of future income, using factors like school attended, major, and earnings trends, all factors that are influenced by socioeconomic status, gender, and race. Schools with lower completion rates serve low-income and non-white students disproportionately. College majors are highly stratified by gender and by race, and the employment market is rife with systemic biases that affect the earnings of women and graduates of color. In this rational ISA world, you end up offering the best financial terms to the least risky student. The white man majoring in engineering comes to mind, and the worst financial terms to the most vulnerable student, seen as a risk to a private investor, the exact type of student who has the most to gain from earning a degree. For those who believe that outcome-based financing is a promising, if untested, tool for students, they should at the very least feel confident that they will have no trouble adhering to existing consumer lending protections, including state usury caps, the Federal Truth in Lending Act, and the Federal Equal Opportunity Credit Act. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tess Michaels, the founder and CEO of Stride Funding. The price of credit is the price of the American dream. And students are uniquely challenged in the legacy system. 2/3 of students are credit invisible, and private lenders try to bridge this gap by requiring cosigners. 92% of private loans require a cosigner, yet 75% of students lack access to a qualified, credit-worthy one. These students are disproportionately from underserved communities where credit has historically been inaccessible due to structural and societal racism. At Stride, we seek to increase access via outcomes-driven funding products like income share agreements. These products really help better align the cost and value of education and allow us to underwrite based on future earnings. Not all schools and programs are created equally, and financial providers alone can't solve the student loan crisis. ISAs aren't a silver bullet, but they are a step in the right direction. We must add more transparency on the front end to help students really understand the value and outcomes of different programs so we can improve individuals' ability to repay. And providers should really start offering wraparound career support services to drive strong outcomes as we do every single day at Stride. Education is key to achieving the American dream, and outcomes-based funding products are a step toward increasing access and beginning to right these historical wrongs.
My name is Ben Kaufman, and I'm the head of investigations at the Student Borrower Protection Center. Nobody wants to solve the student debt crisis and address its role as a key driver of racial, gender, and socioeconomic inequality more than we do. But as we've seen just time and time again at the Student Borrower Protection Center, this new wave of so-called outcomes-based financing is just not the solution that industry has hyped it up to be. Instead, whether it's ISAs or using alternative data to underwrite more traditionally structured loans, the resounding answer from our investigations and our work with thousands of borrowers across the country is that these products don't alleviate inequality, they exacerbate it. For example, our research has uncovered that ISA companies charge students at historically Black colleges and universities more money for the same product. The same is true for students who don't attend an HBCU, but who enroll in majors that are more frequently pursued by women and people of color. All that this unfair pricing does is serve to lock in existing inequality. And because ISAs have to structure their pricing in a way that avoids adverse selection, it's not clear to us that an ISA can possibly work without being discriminatory. The same goes for underwriting more traditional private student loans based on student outcomes, like Climb Credit or Meritize do with their products. It is glaringly apparent through our research and our experience with borrowers that these pricing models are a way, intentional or not, to charge people more precisely because they are discriminated against in the labor market. Once again, that reality is worlds away from the rosy picture that we've seen industry trying to paint. And at the end of the day, here's the point. When we say that a product is predatory or that a practice might violate the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, our point isn't to say that we are playing gotcha with legal technicalities. We're trying to say that people are getting hurt, and that the people hurting them are breaking rules that were put in place to prevent that. Frankly, what we've seen so far in the outcome-based financing space is a really stark reminder for us of why these rules exist in the first place.
MentorWorks supports outcomes-based financing for individuals to get skills and education. We provide career support, networks, and mentoring to help these individuals find employment. MentorWorks stands for equality of opportunity for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or economic background. Fundamentally, we are trying to reach this ideal. If we were to recreate a system that gives equal opportunity to everyone to succeed before we know their place in society, how would we do it? A fixed obligation to pay a cost, regardless of realizing outcomes of the education they get, does not satisfy the equality of opportunity philosophy. Individuals from underserved groups are more sensitive to education costs relative to their income, precisely because they have lower income levels. These individuals also need more time and effort to find employment because they lack the social advantages of well-off individuals. Faced with lower average income levels, a fixed payment obligation eats into a bigger share of their income precisely when they can least afford it. A fixed obligation model is inherently mechanically less progressive. Individuals in these categories need financing models where their obligations take into account their ability to pay. We have recently released an impact report that shows that individuals benefit from the contingency of the payment structure. We find that racial and ethnic minority students have made 7% fewer months of payments and obtained 5% more deferment months in our sample. Outcomes-based financing, in our view, works best when combined with social capital, that is, the intangibles that are critical to finding jobs. This can range from helping someone with their confidence levels in finding jobs, which we know can be a serious issue, as well as provide the professional networks and employer connections willing to help. Again, our report finds that individuals accessing outcomes-based financing are much more likely to seek and use such social capital.
This is Brad Rustin from Nelson Mullins. I support the proposition as forwarded. As we sit today, we see that student loan burdens are increasing, and at the same time, we're seeing additional costs of education, and that is disparately impacting individuals on the basis of their gender, their race, and their ethnicity. A properly structured outcome-based financial product can help to tackle some of those disparities. It can be both a tool and a weapon, either magnifying those disparities or, when structured appropriately, outcome-based financing helps those students maintain manageable debt burdens. It helps address those outcomes, meaning structural disparities that exist between different groups of students. And truly, it helps maintain their quality of life. No longer will students be making decisions on mortgages, investments, other financial products, even something as, to the extent of where they're going to locate geographically, what jobs they're going to take, all are being driven by unmanageable debt levels. And it's hurting people from different groups differently. A properly structured outcome-based student finance product can address those issues. And it's very important as they're developed that they are serving as a tool to shrink that inequity as opposed to magnifying it.
My name is Cheyenne Cabrona, and I'm with the Center for Responsible Lending. And our take is that often white students come into college with much more family wealth than students of color, especially their Black and brown counterparts. This allows students entry into the most competitive programs, the greatest chance at completion, and the greatest ability to pay off student loans. Because these outcomes are largely predicated on race and sometimes gender, outcome-based financing further increases racial and gender inequities, widening rather than narrowing these wealth gaps. Students of color and women don't need another financing option. They need access to education.
I'm Kevin James of Better Future Forward. So yeah, thanks for this opportunity. So this is a tough question, and I think outcomes-based financing, I believe in its power to reduce inequities, but it can also, if done not well, it could make inequities worse. And so I think it's really important how we do it. And fundamentally, where I come down on this is I don't think we can avoid thinking about outcomes. And where I sort of immediately go is we're all here to help students get a good education. And so we have to think about the potential quality of an institution at which we're supporting a student. And I think this is not any different from how we might think about it in the context of the public sector programs. So a perfect example, I think, is gainful employment. I think a rule like that, is just trying to create accountability for workforce programs is trying to ensure that the federal dollars don't flow to institutions that aren't preparing students for success. And I don't see how we can't think about, this work in that same context. And so where I think things can be problematic is that we all know that there's deep inequities within the higher education system, that not every student has access to the same quality of institutions, type of institution, and we can't naively ignore that. And so I think within an outcomes-based framework, we've got to think about If you have a student in front of you and there's an institution that does not have strong outcomes, it can't be a mechanism for just excluding populations of students. It has to be a mechanism for saying, what are the institutions that are consistent with that students' goals and preferences and where they want to be? And can we open doors to institutions that do have strong outcomes and that are going to set that student up for success? And that's where I think we want to be. That's what's going to drive reform and help students be successful. And it's not an easy question, but we can't avoid looking at outcomes. We just have to do it in the right way.
What a great set of speakers. I really want to thank all of them for taking the time to thoughtfully consider and respond to the resolution regarding outcome-based financing and its effect on racial, gender, and economic equity. And we heard a lot of diverse views. Denise, Brad, and Kevin talked about how outcome-based financing can improve education quality, which would disproportionately benefit non-white, female, and low-income students. Tess mentioned how outcome-based financing can help students who lack access to traditional credit, while Karthik discussed how it may be more affordable than traditional loans. Jessica, Ben, and Cheyenne all noted that educational outcomes, on the other hand, themselves track racial, gender, and socioeconomic status of students. So underwriting on the basis of these outcomes may exacerbate rather than close those disparities. We now have two panelists to discuss these diverse views. Maria Early is a partner at the law firm Reed Smith, and Stephen Hayes is a partner at Relman Colfax. Both have previously served in the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and have unique experience with how the law protects against discrimination in the financial industry. Stephen, I want to start with you. You wrote a great report last summer for the Student Borrower Protection Center that raised some concerns regarding outcome-based financing and the primary fair lending law, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, or ECOA. Can you briefly describe how this law works?
Sure, thanks, Ethan. So ECOA prohibits two different types of discrimination. One is intentional discrimination, and in this case, sometimes that takes the form of reverse redlining. So if an ISA is used to induce minority consumers into a predatory educational program, that's a problem. ECOA also prohibits what's called disparate impact, which is a form of unintentional discrimination. And disparate impact requires a three-step framework. The first is, are there disparities? And so as we heard, because disparities exist in criteria like school rankings, any distinctions that you use based on those criteria are likely to replicate those same disparities. And that alone is not illegal, but it could be the sign of a problem. Step two would be, does the policy, the criteria that you're using, serve a legitimate interest? So if you think about school ranking, for example, is it really predictive of expected income? That's an empirical question. And I think anyone providing these products should have good evidence that what they're using actually is predictive. If your evidence is weak, that can be a problem. And then the third step, which I think is probably the most important, is there a less discriminatory alternative to the criteria that you're currently using to price these products, for example? And so that could mean, are there changes to your model? Could you use different criteria than the one you're using to still serve your business interest, but to have fewer disparities at step one? So essentially, I think disparate impact is where a lot of the interesting conversation here is, but that's the essential overview for ECOA.
Gotcha. And so it's sounding like that ECOA is not necessarily saying here are things that you can and can't do, but rather it's more a process that a finance provider would go through, and that it is quite possible that a practice that may on its face look like it may be have it, for example, disparate impact, that when it goes through the process that ECOA may find, or CFPB who enforces ECOA may find that it's actually compliant with the laws. Is that kind of how you're thinking about it?
That's right. I mean, there are certainly things you cannot do, but disparate impact is sort of a building a better mousetrap process. So making sure that the criteria you're using are not built on unproven assumptions and constantly iterating to make sure you're improving the product so that you're not unnecessarily excluding people or pricing a certain group higher than it needs to be priced, for example. So I think that's right. A process of improvement is a good way to think about it.
Gotcha. And Maria, let me bring you in. This conversation around equity oftentimes revolves around ECOA and ECOA violations. but does ECOA actually get us to equity? And kind of in what ways does it fall short?
Yeah, hi, Ethan. Thanks so much. You know, when this panel was first floated to me, I started asking myself, what is equity? And I think I view ECOA as the floor. I mean, ECOA sets forth the legal prescriptions for how we qualitatively measure whether or not there's discrimination, but it doesn't solve the actual issues of equity. And so we know that student lending, for example, now, there are plenty of programs out there that meet and exceed ECOA standards, but we know that Black women like me will pay loans much longer and will pay much more than other groups. So ECOA is not getting to equity. It's not solving for the actual impact of the disparities that exist despite meeting the standards of ECOA. And so I view ISAs and outcome-based financing as a way to look at the actual impact down the road, not just at the point of origination and whether pricing is fair, but really, what does it look like to play out over time? And what are the qualitative measures that we can look at versus just the quantitative? So qualitative being ISAs might be time limited. There might be the overall cost is clear up front. Those things don't happen with traditional student loans. So there are trade-offs that I think get at equity that may or may not fit neatly into ECOA. But I think ECOA is one way to look at this form of financing. But I think we need to move beyond that if we're going to truly get to equity.
And it's such a fascinating discussion because I hear a lot of the critics of outcome-based financing say, that this raises some red flags about equity, and then more the proponents saying, well, there's equity problems in the existing system before we came around, and we're actually trying to solve those problems. And in some sense, it feels like sometimes there's that some of the groups are kind of talking past each other a little bit, focusing on different kind of definitions of equity, if you will. I wanted to ask, Stephen, let me go back to you. The main criticism that we heard was on kind of that outcomes track race, gender, and socioeconomic status. So underwriting on this basis would kind of exacerbate these disparities. Do you think that criticism is fair?
Well, in a sense, for me, I think actually there should be scrutiny on the outcomes, but there are disparities there. I think there should also be scrutiny on the inputs that cause disparities. And if you have or are using very rough metrics to predict those outcomes, and those metrics are just based on intuition that's not proven, that's actually a real problem because that's unnecessary to use that. So for example, using US News ranking of a school is a very rough metric for the expected income of any single individual. Would be probably quite wrong for a lot of people, but that would drive disparities. And so the utility is low. It's based on some very overgeneralized assumptions. Those are the types of things that disparate impact has been quite good at historically eliminating. So coming up with better, more tailored underwriting criteria to get at those incomes, to better predict those outcomes.
Gotcha.
Can I just respond to that, Ethan, in terms of underwriting? And I think that's one of the issues is we accept and we know that the current credit scoring system has built-in discriminatory impacts, and we know it. We know that a woman like me will probably pay more for credit. We know that the existing loan system, whether it's student loans or any kind of loan, generally poor people pay more for credit and wealthy people pay less. That is flipped on its head in ISAs. And I realize that there's a lot more detail that we need to get into with respect to looking at data and making sure that the structure of a particular instrument doesn't lead to discrimination. But we are living now with a system that does unequivocally. And we've talked about this a little bit, but the last year when we've now brought into the national consciousness institutionalized racism and how it impacts people, we've been talking about this. I have been talking about this with my group of friends and family for years. This has been around for years. We really do want to have solutions that may not be perfect, but that try to get at not just what happens in the front, but what happens in the back, not just what we do day one when we underwrite, but what does it look like for someone like me 20 years out? How much have I paid? And is ECOA getting at that? And I do think ECOA is important, very important, but I don't think it's getting at the outcomes. And I think that further exploration of these particular kinds of products does get at those outcomes.
I think actually this is a place too that Marie and I would probably agree. I mean, I'm not a defender of the current system. I think it's quite bad. And a lot of my work now is focused on trying to improve traditional credit markets as well, and using ECOA in a more robust way than I think a lot of institutions have actually applied it internally. And so I would take that same framework and apply it here to say, is our current system great? No, we need to improve it. We need to push on it to eliminate unnecessary disparities there. And I think that same framework would apply to ISAs as well, that whatever system exists now for ISAs, it can probably be improved upon, and it should be.
And I want to turn actually to one other point, not just the financing, but to the quality of the schools themselves, because I think that this seems like this is the ultimate, promise, maybe unfulfilled promise of outcome-based financing. So many of the speakers noted that predatory schools disproportionately harm Black and Hispanic students, and by requiring schools to meet certain quality criteria, that outcomes-based financing can improve equity by kind of cutting off those poorly performing schools. I want to start with Maria. What do you think of this argument?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is HBCUs and the fact that we know now in the past, month or two that they've been historically underfunded, and that, some of the outcomes at HBCUs aren't going to be the same as everywhere else. But we know because of institutional racism and, other structural issues that exists. That's the way it is in our society. So I don't know. These are really, really hard issues. But I do think that we have to look at what the institution itself, again, not just the quantity, but the quality and the other things that an institution might provide to historically underserved communities, and not just the outcomes of those institutions, but some of those things as well.
And I want to put actually a finer point on this and ask Stephen you this question. So when I hear outcome-based financing providers talking about, well, we don't want to be lending to predatory schools, we need to be looking at outcomes, I almost hear something like the gainful employment rule, right? Where the federal government would basically say that if you're a school that is not producing good employment outcomes, then you're not going to be part of the Title IV system. Your students are not going to be eligible for federal loans. So is outcome-based financing basically just private financiers that are saying, hey, we want to follow the lead of the federal government. We want to adopt a gainful employment rule. You all have been talking about how this would be great for the government to drive outcomes. So let's adopt this ourselves. What do you agree with that analogy? And do you have some concerns around that?
I have concerns, I think, similar to Maria's. The metrics that we use there for what's a performing school, they're very nuanced, and that could be used in a way to cut off funding for certain schools. They're quite good. On the other hand, I think there is actually a tranche of schools which are qualitatively different. They're not the HBCUs. They're actually predatory for-profit institutions. We've litigated reverse redlining cases in that context. And in my mind, when you come across a school like that, is quite clearly predatory. It's just a different degree. It's not the HBCUs of the world. And in that case, I think there is actually an obligation on any institution that's going to suggest they would provide financing there to make sure they're not inducing students to enroll in predatory programs. Now, drawing that line, I don't think is very difficult. Drawing the line about what's a performing school, like in the sense of how gainful employment might rank someone, a school, it can be more nuanced and complicated.
Gotcha. And I just, I'll just add to that. I think that, there was a group of speakers that really emphasized that, outcome-based financing just isn't inherently good or bad, but rather it's just kind of this powerful tool that needs to be wielded responsibly. So I know that Kevin ended with kind of, we can't avoid looking at outcomes, we just have to do it in the right way. And I think that that's consistent with kind of what I'm hearing from both of you, that, it's not that this is inherently bad, but we just need to be careful about it. We need to make sure that the metrics that we're using are, not maybe U.S. News and World Report, but things that are proven to kind of really show that they're predictive of outcomes. So Maria, Stephen, we have so much more that we could be talking about. This conversation could go on for another hour. So I really want to thank you both for joining this very brief but informative panel. And I hope that we can kind of have you both back here for a future event. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.